Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to the third day of the conference, What's New, What's Next? Innovative Methods, New Sources, and Paradigm Shifts in Jewish Studies. And I have a great pleasure today to welcome our third keynote presenter, Professor Havi Dreyfus, who will be presenting her talk, Beyond Traditional Methods, 5 Thoughts of What is New and What is Next in Jewish Studies. We will have the talk of Professor Dreyfus first, then 4 responses to the talk. And after that, Professor Dreyfus will answer the questions that will appear in the responses, and then we will open the floor to the public. So I encourage you to write your questions during the meeting via chat, and I will pass them to all our participants. And I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. Of course, my name is Michał Trębacz. I'm head of the research department at the Polin Museum and assistant professor at the Center for Jewish Research at the University of Łódź. And I will be shortly introducing Professor Dreyfus first, and then before their responses, I will be introducing the others. Professor Dreyfus is a professor of Jewish history and head of the Institute of the History of Polish Jewry and Israel-Poland Relations at the Tel Aviv University. And she is also the director of the Center for Research on Holocaust in Poland at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. Her research deals with various aspects of everyday life during the Holocaust, including the relationships between Jews and Poles, religious life in the light of the Holocaust, and Jewish experience in the face of the extermination. Her last book, The Warsaw Ghetto, The End, April 1942, June 1943, was published in Hebrew in 2018, and it will be shortly published also in English. So, Professor Dreyfus, the virtual microphone is yours.
Thank you, dear Michał, for your kind opening words. And I also wish to express my gratitude to the organizers of this fascinating conference. For the last few days, I've been zooming and listening closely to engaging discussions about what is new and what is next in Jewish studies, and endless ongoing debates for sure will continue those meetings. In my lecture and in the paper I sent earlier for this session, I was asked to address a question beyond traditional methods, referring to boundaries and schemes that must be crossed or preserved in Jewish studies, and shining a light on misconceptions, dichotomies, and illusions. This topic brought me to refer to 5 main points, some of which other speakers have already addressed in their illuminating discussions, whether in detail or in general. And yet, I would like to tackle them briefly. Beyond traditional methods, 5 thoughts of what is new and what is next in Jewish studies. First, dichotomies of Jewish studies. As Professor Genet referred to in our first keynote lecture, Jewish studies and the study of Judaism are not necessarily identical. True, related to the ability and desire to critically examine Jewish sources and the Jewish past, and both raise fundamental questions of cohesion and continuity to which I do not wish to review here. Those issues were discussed deeply by many, as Ismail Schwartz, Michael Meyer, Moshe Rossman, just to mention a few. Nevertheless, one should emphasize that there is no absolute overlap between Wissenschaft des Judentums, Jewish studies, whatever its definition may be, and the history of the Jews of Poland, a topic that is rightly so at the center of this academic meeting. We are thus discussing here, and actually in many other places, the important topic of Jewish studies within a very limited academic community or communities. True, in the 18th century, close to 90% of the world Jews lived in Eastern Europe, and the patterns and movement that developed there had a decisive influence on the Jewish world and its development. But Jewish studies are far beyond that. They begin in antiquity, a period which demands integration of history and archaeology, through the days of the Second Temple, Mishnah and Talmud, in which sources are fundamentally different from those discussed by many scholars of Polish Jewry, and even the examination of the European Ashkenazi communities in the early Middle Ages often goes beyond the focus of our interest as Polish Jewry historians. That is, we all belong in one way or another to Jewish studies, but write mainly within a much more limited academic community. The Holocaust, as an example, my main field of interest, is a field that has grown over the years. It is not the focus of this meeting, still it's worth mentioning. It took time, actually decades, to understand that not only Nazi Germany is an important topic, but also the Jewish fate. The Holocaust is something that should be scholarly examined. Today, Holocaust studies have their own research institution, journals, and researchers, and yet they are closely linked to modern European history, the history of the Second World War, racism, and genocide, and some scholars would add additional context as mass violence, ethnic struggles, imperialism, and colonialism. Other participants of this conference who engage in the study of Hasidism, as an example, and we could hear that clearly and see it in the previous days, map their academic space differently and point to other research contexts. They too refer to Jewish history and European history. Still, they also place themselves among scholars of literature, Jewish and non-Jewish thought, religious studies, and more. True, both Hasidism scholars and Holocaust researchers, for both Hasidism scholars and Holocaust researchers, Poland has a central place. But most of our research questions, documentation, chronological sequences, and geographical representation differ. So what are Jewish studies for us, Polish Jewish scholars specializing in the Holocaust, Hasidism, literature, or 20th century urbanization? What are our academic communities to which we belong and respond, and how do they shape our research? Or how similar and how different is a research on a given topic conducted in Poland, Israel, or the United States, despite our global academic world? In Holocaust studies, I can say, we see at least two contradictory phenomena. On the one side, what was once an Israeli Jewish field has become a worldwide community. Leading Holocaust scholars who deal with fundamental question of Jewish life are neither Israeli nor Jewish, and significant research projects in the field have been launched in the United States and Germany. Nevertheless, even today, there are local characteristics to our studies, and unfortunately, most of us are rooted in a particular research community more than that we would like to admit. Awareness of our own sub-communities within Jewish studies, Polish Jewish research, or Holocaust studies, and attempts to leave our academic comfort zone is a necessary step in breaking the chronological, geographical, and thematic boundaries that exist in our research, which of course is easier said than done. Second, conceptualization. In the last 2 days, we heard some thorough references to the issue of conceptualization. And apparently, even when we focus on a specific subject, our conceptualization is often ambiguous, and I would like to refer here to two aspects. First, as David Engel argued regarding anti-Semitism, conceptualization has an impact on our research question. Cases of physical attacks in the East European sphere, as an example, are usually called pogroms. But dealing with assaults of Jews within the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict raises not only the framework of pogroms, but also of riots and events as Jaffa riots of 1921. While in the context of American Jewry, it would raise the term lynching and the connections of violence against African Americans. Therefore, discussing cases of injury, murder, or humiliation of Jews by local populations will change according to the context. Second, conceptualization might limit research. As I referred in my paper, the usage of the term righteous among the nations had a conceptual price in the academic debate of Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust. This moral term shaped the field for decades, despite being unhistorical, and created long-lasting distortions and lacunas. Thus, only in recent years, no notion exceeding from the limited moral term of righteous among the nation emerged as paid rescuers and Jews who rescue Jews. I believe this is true regarding other key concepts of Holocaust studies, as bystanders, which is very much questioned in the last decades, indifference, which, as Darius Stola stated for years, refers to inaction more than to motivation, and even the term Amidah, another moral concept which has a long-lasting influence on Holocaust studies. I cannot elaborate too much here, but I will say that this concept was created at times of a very critical public atmosphere concerning Holocaust survivors, the time of talking of them as those who went as sheep to the slaughter. Creating the term Amidah was actually an intellectual demand of historian survivors to present the Jewish responses in the Holocaust and both their so-called dark and bright aspects. Over the years, this term has expanded as a non-historical moral category, including almost endless action, political, education, cultural activities, writing diaries, poems, or conducting research during the war, public health, self-aid, and more. It became a very long list, which is still expanding. Amidah may have a place in educational arena and commemoration activities. Still, its contribution to contemporary historical discussion is limited, and more important, it restricts our ability to critically analyze the variety of Jewish and non-Jewish responses to the Holocaust, as well as other historical events. For this reason, conceptualization requires scholars to clarify their concept and context and obligates them to be aware of lacuna and biases that stem from the concept discussed. 3. Archives and sources. My main claim regarding archive and sources was that although we think our research questions lead us to our sources and archives, many times it is actually vice versa. It is in fact archival sources that shape our research questions and sometimes even limit them. As well known and as heard very clearly yesterday, archives are not a natural and blind collection of records reflecting existing documentation. They have their own history, and many times they preserve certain materials and neglect other, as in national collection, records of a given movement, and even thematic archives. Naming sources that not have been addressed in the past as visual documentation, modern archaeology, reference to language, time, or space is important. Yet many times it is easier to name them than define lacunas resulting from reliance on specific collection and archives. One example is the underrepresentation of Orthodox life in Ringelblum archive, as well as in Holocaust research. Without diminishing the importance of the Ringelblum archive, and despite the few Orthodox documents preserved in it, numerous key figures within the Orthodox society, as well as central topics of its existence, lack from this impressive collection. And this is also, along other reasons connected to the development of Holocaust studies, has an impact on research. One can easily find information about a rabbi who served in a given community before the war and discover if a specific shtetl had a Bes Yaakov school. But what happened to that rabbi or those pupils during the war? Geves. We hardly integrate daily life of those Orthodox Jews who accounted for about 30% of pre-war Polish Jews in the Holocaust. Did the rabbis continue to be public leaders even when their community became refugees? How did overcrowding in the ghettos affect law of separation between men and women? And did religious Jews really refrain from living under false identity or in hiding? Unfortunately, the discussion on religious life in the Holocaust focuses on several figures, not always the most senior ones, and mainly on questions of preservation or unpreservation of mitzvot, while the life of Orthodox Jews did not become part of this complex story of the Holocaust. This lacuna is not exclusive so-called problem of the Ringelblum archive or Holocaust studies. Awareness of blind spots of collection and archives can open an area of original research questions, which often deviate from the given archive. 4. Challenges of the digital world. Again, this is another topic tackled by others, mainly yesterday's most interesting seat on exploring Jewish history in the digital age. But referring to the topic beyond traditional methods, one cannot avoid discussing digital changes and their impact on our scholarly world, which as a historian raises, I hope, some additional insights. Two most essential features presented yesterday were accessibility and big data. Accessibility of archives and the ability to browse various material in large, light, and darkened documents, which in the past were examined with a magnifying glass in archives, are important technical tool of the digital world. Moreover, having a database which were unattainable dream for a teacher and are now a keystroke away, as Responsa Project, Jewish Historical Press, and many other projects mentioned yesterday, open new horizons for scholars. Those features enable gathering vast amounts of information and promote rapid and effective quantitative and qualitative analyses. At the same time, one should admit that even if those tools are innovative, not all methods are so pioneering. Dictionaries and concordances existed in the past, even if in a less accessible way, and quantitative and qualitative analyses are in no means a new field in Jewish studies. As in other cases, primary methodological questions remain the same. From what collection is a scholar mining knowledge, archive, and how does he or she catalog the findings, conceptualization. Innovation does not necessarily lie in the skill of technology, but as in the past, in the original questions being asked. Yet, I do wish to state that this technological revolution of digital humanities involves both possibilities and illusions, one of which is connected to the impressive accessibility of knowledge in our time. We live in the age of information. In the Western world, and many times even beyond it, human beings are literate and many have access to the internet. As a result, access to database and knowledge is unprecedented, and our finding could easily become global. However, this accessibility only questions former knowledge agents. That is, the age of information is also necessarily the age of undermining the hegemony of knowledge. Wikipedia, for example, is an enterprise of vast mass wisdom, which has become a daily address for many, including educated people and scholars. It is actually replacing many times researchers, academic institutions, or books written by them. Furthermore, contrary to the popular belief, there is a gap, often intentional in structure, in the information provided about historical events, not at least about contested historical events. One can find significant differences in English, Hebrew, Polish, German, and Russian about the Holocaust. Alongside accidental inaccuracies, one can find true fake history, as well as entries with explicit biases. There is intentionally misleading information, not only on Yad Vabner or Kelce, but also in highlighting assistance given to the Jews Bibles in many entries. So part of these digital worlds mean that people know more, but their knowledge is not necessarily accurate. This also emphasizes our roles as humanities scholars, encouraging critical thinking and teaching how history is made. That is, how knowledge agents, on their behalf or behalf of others, use historical documents and complex past to present a simple and simplistic pseudo-history. This is a real challenge, especially in times of political struggle over memory and history, as we have witnessed in the recent years, which bring me to the last and fifth point. Present and past, who influences whom? Holocaust researchers, and not only those scholars, share an interesting illusion. We tend to believe that our scholarly work significantly impacts public discourse, and yet usually the opposite happens. It is a public discourse that shapes research. This issue is closely linked to the complicated relationship between regime and academia, and in this context, government attempts in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Lithuania, Israel, and the United States to reshape history and historical discourse. In the Polish case, efforts to control historical narrative in museums, legal changes promoting the protection of the good name of the Polish nation, whatever that concept may be, and reassessing academic publication are partial examples. Thus, this regime seeks to promote research and commemoration of 800 years of Polish Jewry, including Jews murdered by Nazi Germany, and those, of course, were the majority. Yet at the same time, it aggressively reduced and restrict delving into cases of Jews murdered due to direct or indirect Polish involvement. I do not wish to refer here to the illusion of those political factors, believing they are narrowing balanced academic discussion on charged issues, while truly encouraging more scholarly publication on those topics. But I do wish to refer to illusion and jeopardies of scholars. First, academic circles might channel all their efforts to contemporary discussions, thus reducing academic discourse rather than expanding it. Second, sometimes scholars wish to influence non-academic political discourse by using, and sometimes misusing, their historical knowledge. In Israel, Poland, or the US, we all have political views and we all think our political views are justified. Nevertheless, trying to mobilize the past to prove current political question usually will not contribute to those views or the scholarly world, and our readers, students, or the general public deserve knowing if it is a scholar or the citizen speaking. As in other cases, being straightforward and honest is a necessary but unsatisfactory condition. Those 5 initial thoughts reflect various mental, thematic, and methodological boundaries we should recognize. Some must be broken, other needs to be preserved, but it would be an illusion to think that those actions would unravel the cables of our professional practice. Even if we do succeed, they will only define new illusions and questions, and further inquiries of beyond traditional methods will emerge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Havi. Yes, and our first respondent is Professor Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska, who is a professor of comparative literature at Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin. She researches and publishes in translation studies, Jewish studies, and American literature. Her books include Polska Izaaka Bashevica-Zingera, Rozstanie i powrót, Contemporary Jewish Writing in Poland, an Anthology, Odcienie tożsamości, literatura żydowska jako zjawisko wielojęzyczne, a także Tam kiedyś był mój dom, Księgi pamięci gmin żydowskich, which was also translated My Home Used to Be There, Memorial Books of Jewish Communities. She has translated more than a dozen books from English and Yiddish into Polish. Professor Adamczyk-Garbowska, the virtual microphone is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation, especially as a respondent to this important session, the more so that I am in minority. I am not a historian, and from the description on the conference page, it says that we are on the main stage. I guess this is the new term for plenary session, but it sounds quite grand. Some remarks, because this is a very rich paper that Professor Dreyfus presented. She raised a number of very important points, so a detailed response to her analysis of the current state of research would obviously require more time. So within my time limit, I am going to refer to only some points that I consider particularly interesting, that attracted my attention, and also those that are relevant to my experience as a literary scholar, philologist, and translator. And I will necessarily look at the problem largely from the Polish perspective. Havi Dreyfus rightly points out problems with terminology in reference to Jewish and Judaic studies. What in fact are Jewish studies? There are numerous problems with defining the field. For example, are studies on Polish Jewish literature, Polish attitudes towards Jews during the Holocaust and after, on images of Jews in Polish literature or cinema, or even on the history of particular Polish cities and towns with large Jewish populations before the Second World War, Jewish studies or not. Very often such research is conducted by scholars who either work in departments or centers of so-called Jewish or Judaic studies, or identify themselves as Jewish studies scholars. But the research they conduct is very different from the classical understanding of Judaic studies deeply rooted in Hebrew sources. Being on the committee of the doctoral seminar at the Polin Museum, one that is responsible for granting an award named after the initiators of the revival of Jewish studies in Poland in the 1980s, Professors Honor Meruk and Józef Gierowski, I am well aware how often we face the dilemma which doctoral projects or published books can be treated as representative of Polish Jewish studies per se, and which are only indirectly related to the field. This is this kind of dilemma that appears quite often. Another question refers to differences in research on a given topic conducted in Poland, Israel, and the United States. We could obviously add other countries, and a necessity to take into consideration local characteristics and the effect of different perspectives. Research that can be considered innovative in one country may be treated as derivative in another, and research that may seem crucial from one perspective might raise little interest in another context. I remember how in 2001, in the middle of the public debate in Poland on Jan Gross's Neighbors, a reporter on the main Polish evening TV news tried to do a street survey in Israel, asking people's opinions about the book. They were rather surprised by the question and not really engaged in the topic. At that time, a number of Poles believed that an average Israeli or American must have read and discussed the book. They didn't understand that research on the pogrom in Jedwabne and other places was most important from the point of view of Polish historiography, because a number of Israeli or American scholars, not to mention survivors, learned about such cases much earlier, since they were described in Isker-Bichir post-war reports, various testimonies, and family histories. While talking about archives and sources, Harvey Dreyfus mentions how available collections shape research and how awareness of blind spots of collections and archives can open up an array of original and innovative research questions. So in a way, absence of some sources can be creative, paradoxically, as it may stimulate some hypotheses and new research questions and encourage or even force scholars to look for different types of documentation. For example, in the context of Holocaust research, visual documentation or archaeological findings. Harvey Dreyfus's comments make me think also about another aspect of our today's topic, that is extending the field of research to areas that earlier were considered not worth of attention. The notable Jewish scholar Yakov Schatzky criticized Isker-Bichir Jewish memorial books more than 60 years ago, stating that they are like tombstones and no one studies tombstones. Today, we know that very interesting research has been done on the basis of studying multilingual inscriptions on tombstones in Jewish cemeteries, and the same has been gradually applied to areas earlier considered marginal, such as popular literature, advertisement, calendars, posters, textbooks, etc. Obviously, this turn has been also inspired by development in other humanities outside Jewish studies. What's more, this aspect of extending research concerns not only new types of sources and genres, but also the historical and linguistic dimension. This has been being done within the last 3 or 4 decades, but some fields were so neglected because of post-war political situation in Poland and other Eastern European countries, because of censorship, limited international contacts, that now scholars are still in the process of making up for the lost time. So there are a number of topics that should have been researched much earlier and filling in various gaps. So there is a lot to be done. Undoubtedly, there is enormous progress in the field of widely understood Jewish studies. 30 years ago, it would have been hard to imagine a young Polish scholar doing thorough research on Yiddish or Hebrew press or literature, because practically no young Polish scholar knew Yiddish or Hebrew. Nowadays, such studies are mushrooming, and more scholars realize the need of revising and complementing earlier findings. So basically, some monograph of, let's say, towns and cities in Poland should be, or Eastern Europe should be rewritten. However, there are still new publication based on sources in only one language. For example, just recently I came across a book on Zionism published in Poland, in which the author doesn't use any sources in Yiddish or Hebrew, but fortunately such works are rare nowadays. Javi Dreyfus mentioned also possibilities and illusions of the technological revolution. And I could add that quite often young scholars limit their searches to sources and studies available on internet, or gather enormous amounts of data, but don't know how to make use of it. Not everything has been digitized, so some books and articles that are available only in hard copies tend to be neglected. While reviewing various papers written by young scholars, I'm not prejudiced against young scholars, but I'm just mentioning this as a kind of my recent experience, I am surprised that some of them don't include items published even not so long ago, like 15, 20 years ago, and sometimes start from scratch, writing about something that was already fairly well researched earlier, reinventing the wheel, so to speak. We know that traditional research has its pluses. For example, browsing between the books may lead to interesting discoveries and unexpected turns in research. The late Janet Hadda, well known for her research on Yiddish literature, recalls in her introduction to Isaac Bashevis Singer's biography how in 1968, she as a miserable graduate student of Germanic linguistics at Cornell, left her study desk in the library and wandered around stacks. By pure accident, she found herself in a Jewish literature section and came across a fat volume by someone called Isaac Bashevis Singer. After reading a small section, she was already hooked. And the authors of the book Slow Professor, Challenging the Culture of Speed in the Academy, published 5 years ago, stressed the fact that for scholars wandering between shelves is often very inspiring. You can then find something that you were not looking for that will stimulate new searches. Of course, one can also browse in the internet, but this is a different type of experience. So perhaps combining traditional and very modern methods is a good solution. As to comments on research on Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust, apart from political implications that could be the theme of another panel, and I think these issues are raised during the conference, is the problem of balance and objectivity. Michael Steinlauf, in his pioneering book on Poland and the memory of the Holocaust, states that he prides himself as being perceived as pro-Jewish among Poles and pro-Polish among Jews. And Moshe Rossman, in his excellent study of 2012 on the Polin Museum, mentions a number of topics that still raise controversies or that scholars simply prefer to avoid. So it seems that there are still some areas that are waiting for their turn. Two postulates that I would like to raise in the context of this response, and generally having in mind the future of Jewish studies, are the necessity of using multilingual sources and the importance of international cooperation. These two postulates are obviously interconnected. In recent years, a number of scholars have appeared who try to follow in the footsteps of eminent Jewish historians of the past, for whom the knowledge of Hebrew, Yiddish, and Polish, and additionally German and Russian, English wasn't necessary at that time, was a natural thing. Some Israeli scholars and American scholars, other foreign scholars, make an effort to learn Polish, and some Polish scholars try to learn Hebrew and Yiddish. But we know that this is not easy, and usually this linguistic knowledge is limited to two languages. So, for example, in Poland, we witnessed an unprecedented development of Yiddish studies or perhaps more precisely Polish Yiddish studies, but most authors of works in this field usually are not sufficiently familiar with Hebrew sources. So this image is not complex enough. On the other hand, there are studies on the Hebrew press or literature, but usually with no or very limited presence of the Yiddish or Polish component. Closer cooperation between scholars in such cases could be beneficial, and communication via internet that developed so rapidly due to the pandemic can help a great deal in this respect. In the conclusion to his frequently quoted article on trilingual Jewish culture in Poland before the Second World War, Honor Szmeruk stated, I quote, "If we examine the three cultural systems, it seems that none was complete in itself. No one system could independently and exclusively provide all the elements expected in a full cultural system. This important conclusion fully applies to research in the area of Polish Jewish studies. There's no time for details, obviously, but I could list a number of examples how foreign scholars could have avoided linguistic or factual errors if they had consulted their Polish colleagues, and obviously the same things applies to Polish scholars with insufficient knowledge of foreign languages and sources. And to conclude, towards the end of her paper, Professor Dreyfus mentions various kinds of simplifications and manipulations, some unintended, like in kind of hastily prepared, let's say, entries to Wikipedia, others premeditated, dictated by political agendas. This is not a problem limited to Jewish studies, since politics is entering academia in a number of countries, partly through the participations of scholars themselves. While being aware of this, it is crucial in the field of Jewish studies in Poland, Israel, and elsewhere to rise above this trend and remain focused on our research and its sources to save and develop the valuable work that has already been done. So this is my hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Adamczyk-Grabowska. And our next respondent is Valery Dymschitz, who is a research fellow at Petersburg Judaica Center, European University in St. Petersburg, and a professor at the Liberal Arts Department of St. Petersburg State University. His chief area of research is the cultural anthropology and folklore of East European Jewry, folk and academic Jewish art, Jewish literature, Russian Jewish literature. In his translation or under his editing were published about 25 books and collections of articles, including Jewish folk tales or the Shtetl 21st century. He's a member of editorial boards of journals like Judaic Slavic Journal and Yiddishland. Professor Dymschitz, the virtual microphone is now yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation. It is not only a great honor for me to join this conference, but first of all, it is a very interesting event, and it's my pleasure to hear both the lecture and the responses. Professor Dreyfus named 5 new challenges that are already causing and will cause changes in the field of Jewish studies. She lists them: dichotomies of Jewish studies, conceptualization, archives and sources. I'm going through her paper, challenges of a digital world, present and past. What present and past, who influence who? The last one is the political challenge that interfere with the work of a historian, making him both the subject and the object of a political ideas, the historical process. All these challenges Professor Dreyfus illustrated by the examples from her own research field from the Holocaust studies. There is no doubt that other areas of Jewish studies face the same or more or less the similar challenges. The problems and perspectives are named correctly. Majority of researchers face them one way or another. However, it seems to me that the scope and the impact, so to speak, the weight, the specific weight of the problems is different. Especially, it's something subjective, of course. Yes, some challenges are more important for me as a researcher, and I'll stress in this list of 5 challenges what is the most specific according to my own personal research experience. The first number in Professor Dreyfus' list was occupied by dichotomies of Jewish studies. It is an old problem. Each researcher in the field of the humanity has a dual identity. One from the point of view of discourse, either he can be a historian, a philologist, a historian of art, and so on, and or a specialist in the history of religion. The other from the point of view of the object of the research. Of course, Jewish history, Jewish literature, Jewish art, Jewish something is an object, yes? Another thing is that Jewish studies since the time of Wissenschaft, the Studentums have defined themselves much more, not by the method of research, but by its object. Jewish studies still exist in many ways in the ghetto. I'm afraid that the walls of this ghetto are not only high and strong, but they are reinforced from 2 sides, from inside and from outside. The achievements of a specialist in other fields would be useful for specialists in Jewish studies, and vice versa. Many case studies in the Jewish studies would be interesting to many specialists in other fields. But this most often still does not happen. Very little research works made in Jewish studies appears outside of specialized journals and special conferences. Even more, Professor Adamczyk-Garbowska mentioned that now we have a new generation of the researchers who received the professional education, good knowledge of archives, languages, and so on, in the field of Jewish studies, yes? And when I'll compare my generation, people who came in the field of Jewish studies in the end of 80s, early 90s in the Soviet Union, we were pioneers. There were no professionals in Jewish studies in the former Soviet Union, of course, yes? So everybody came from outside with his or her professional background, connected with other fields in other disciplines in humanities or natural science. Yes. Now we have a new generation of people who received professional education in Jewish studies. They made all their degrees from the very beginning, yes, from the bachelor degree till their doctoral degree in the field of the Jewish studies. They are absolutely professional. Their erudition is much better than the erudition of their professors often. But what about their knowledge, their erudition in the other fields, in the other disciplines, in their possibility to make some comparative studies, to find the analogies outside the specific Jewish field? I'm not sure, yes? So paradoxically, this, of course, it's a great result. It's a wonderful thing that now we have a generation of young researchers who are professionals in Jewish studies. But paradoxically, their professionalism makes the walls of this academic ghetto even higher and thicker and stronger. Let us go forward. The problem of conceptualization does not look new. We are constantly trying to expand and refine our conceptual apparatus. This is a common working moment in any research work. I will add that Jewish studies is still full of uncritically perceived concepts formulated in the era of romantic historiography. Overcoming this mental inertia is not always easy. The most perspective, for me, of course, problem that Professor Dreyfus highlights is what she mentioned under the title Archives and Sources. This topic looks particularly interesting to me as a specialist in Jewish folklore, ethnography, and cultural anthropology. Even now, in the 21st century, a lot can still be recorded in the field, and we recorded a lot in the former shtetls in Ukraine, in Moldavia, Belarus, and so on, from the last, maybe the last Jewish inhabitants of such places. I see Jeffrey is smiling because I mentioned such places as Tulchin, Mogilев-Podolsky, Bershit, and so on and so on. Yes, but of course, we understand that the materials is running out. The main sources for us as specialists in Jewish cultural anthropology are now archives and texts collected and created by authors and collectors in the past. However, already at the very first moment of recording, and even more so at the time of publication, material was selected. Our special interest should be directed to the ideological and methodological grounds of the work and collecting activities of our predecessors. For example, when we compare the materials which were collected in the field of Jewish folklore in the pre-revolution years, in the Pale of Settlement years, and in 20s, the time distance is very short. The materials look absolutely different because the ideological backgrounds, the methods of the folklorists from the, I don't know, from Ansky circle, yes, and the first generation of Soviet Jewish folklorists who collected ethnographic and folklore materials in 20s were absolutely different. They were looking for different, and they found different, and they show different, and they publish different things. It looks like they spoke with the two different folks, two different nations, but they worked in the same shtetls with the same Jewish population. Yes, only this will give us the critic of the backgrounds, of the methodological grounds of the collectors from the previous generation. Only this will give us a chance to correctly understand not only what new sources we are including in our circulation from the archives, for example, but also what they are telling us. In a word, Jewish studies should concentrate on itself. And this is not just an interest to the history of our field, our research field. It's not only the part of the history of humanities, but a necessary tool for the proper use of our old and new sources from different archives. Professor Dreyfus mentioned also the challenges of the digital world, including the clogging of the information environment and forming via popular internet publications a new public view of the problems of history. Undoubtedly is a serious problem, and at the same time is a new research material, a rich field for digital anthropology and even digital folkloristic. In fact, the diverse contemporary Jewish world on the internet is a rich new field for anthropologists, for folklorists, and not only for them. For example, it seems that no one has specifically thought about the fact that Yiddish is now one of the most popular languages on the internet. Thanks to the internet, Yiddish received a new impetus, new environment, new resources. And Yiddish on internet looks for me as a wonderful research topic for specialists in social linguistics. So the digitalization is not only the problem, it is also the new research field, some sort of a crossroad between the traditional problems and new one. Finally, the problem of politicizing of academic research in the field of Jewish studies poses to us as a community a number of painful questions for which there is no quick and easy solutions. I will speak about my own experience. For example, the sharply deteriorated relations between Ukraine and Russia just now, as a result of a Russian aggression, led to a sharp complication of academic contacts, loss of access for researchers in the field of Jewish studies to Ukrainian materials, museums, libraries, conferences, and so on and so on. Now Ukrainian border is closed for us, or maybe not the worst thing, but the most unpleasant is the situation in that any academic discussion is now tied with a political terms. Unfortunately, I myself witnessed how some Ukrainian colleagues, for example, accused the Russian critics of imperialism and chauvinism in response to any academic remark. For example, a Russian I'm speaking about it's a very concrete illustration. In Kiev was published new translations of Shalom Aleichem. Of course, any new translation of a classic, it's a great thing. It's very useful. Yes, the first in the preface to the new translation, it was written that the reason for the new translation, it's not the great possibility to translate classic on the contemporary Ukrainian, but to show to the contemporary Ukrainian reader the real Shalom Aleichem, because the previous Soviet translation into Russian and into Ukrainian were false from the ideological point of view. Yes, we are not struggling for the quality of the new translations. We are struggling against the Soviet past, which is more or less a political mythology, in this case, concrete. And one of my colleagues, Ukrainian colleagues, one of my Russian colleagues criticized the new translations, and Ukrainian colleagues declare that criticism to is the fact of Russian aggression, and do not even consider it necessary to enter into substantive conversation. Russian policy towards Ukraine is terrible, of course, and accidental and unexpected victim of this policy was the dialogue, which was very fruitful dialogue between the researchers from Russian Federation, from Moscow and Petersburg from one side, and from Kiev from other side. We had a very fruitful dialogue for 20 years, and now such dialogue in the field of Jewish studies is more or less became more or less quite problematic and unpleasant. So we can see that the academic life, everyday academic life, became problematic because of a different political reasons. So this is my response to wonderful lecture of Professor Dreyfus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tymschitz. Our third respondent is Professor Jeffrey Kopstein, who is a professor of political science at the University of California in Irvine. In his research, Professor Kopstein focuses on the interethnic violence against patterns of minority groups and anti-liberal tendencies in civil societies. paying special attention to cases within European and Russian Jewish history. These interests are central topic in his latest co-authored book, Intimate Violence, Anti-Jewish Pogroms on the Eve of the Holocaust. And during 2021-2022 academic year, he is Aina Levine Invitational Scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where he is writing his next book, which will be entitled, thought to be entitled, The Three Pogroms, the Anti-Jewish Violence from Antiquity to the Holocaust. Professor Kopstein, the virtual microphone is yours. And just one more remark, I encourage all of those who are listening to ask questions, because there are already some questions that were asked and they may not be time to answer if you will wait too long.
Thank you very much. And can everybody hear me? Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to comment on this. It's a wonderful paper, actually, and it raises some really important questions. Of course, the only one who's worse off than me here is Jeff Weidlinger, because he's going to have to go last. And everything's already been said already, but it hasn't been said by me. So you're going to get it here a little bit again, and hopefully something new. Javi Dreyfus has taken on the very difficult charge of devising and analyzing what she terms 5 thoughts about what's new in Jewish studies. Each of these deserves a paper unto itself. There's a great deal to chew on in Dreyfus's fruitful presentation, so I'll restrict myself to 3 thoughts on her 5 thoughts. First, what exactly is Jewish studies? And this has been raised already. Given that it encompasses so much, how do the disparate parts relate to each other, and how much should they? Dreyfus poses a huge question, and my answer is little better than a hot take. On the one hand, there's nothing different in Jewish studies than in any other broad subject, such as my own, political science and history. We don't expect any single definition of political science or sociology or history, except in the broadest and most trivial sense of the word. On the other hand, Jewish studies at most universities, at least in North America, is not a standalone discipline. It's one that is spread out, integrated at best, but mostly spread out across the humanities and social sciences. Now, is there anything Jewish about Jewish studies? This has also been brought up already. Except for the fact that Jewish studies studies Jews, Jewish thought, Jewish history, languages, literatures, cultures, there's really nothing Jewish about it. And it would be weird if it were. In fact, Jewish studies, I believe, will only be vibrant to the extent that it's not Jewish. Now, I mean by this, not that Jews should be effaced within Jewish studies, far from it. Rather, first and most obviously, and this is trivial, non-Jews should engage in Jewish studies. We're not a yeshiva. But also, and this is my main point, that Jewish studies should be engaged in the import and export of concepts, ideas, theories, and empirical material to and from other fields. It should be integrated and integrate itself into other fields of inquiry. These are the signs of a healthy and non-parochial subject. Of course, there's much to be gained by turning energies inward, but it would be obviously be intellectually unhealthy if the ideas and concepts within Jewish studies were neither imported from elsewhere nor exported to other disciplines. And this import and export invites comparison and analogy, the very essence of human thought. I think to the extent to which a discipline succeeds in exporting its ideas and concepts to other disciplines is a good standard for measuring its vibrancy and success. But as Javi Dreyfus reminds us, this is where the dilemma begins. She illustrates her points in Jewish studies with references, really incredible references, ranging from antiquity to the Holocaust, where she reminds us she's home as a scholar. In my own discipline, political science, it's noteworthy that the Holocaust, until recently, was almost never discussed. I know this is weird. In fact, the first panel on the Holocaust in the more than 100-year history of the American Political Science Association, whose first president was actually Woodrow Wilson. And it was very strange, I know. This first panel in the history of the association on the Holocaust occurred in 2011. I know because I organized it. And I raised, it's not that there weren't papers, but there was never a panel devoted to it. And I raise this because it's emblematic of how rarely Jewish studies has exported concepts and methods into the study of political science, into the study of political violence for so long, notwithstanding the dozens of books and papers on other instances of political violence and genocide. And even though the Holocaust itself is the index case for the study of violence in the contemporary world. How could this be? Dreyfus deftly points out how most of us belong to both narrower and broader research communities. But one question that occurs to me is how much we, as Jewish studies scholars, give back to the broader research communities that almost all of us are also part of. Or even closer to home, how much we as scholars of the Holocaust, or Polish Jewry, or antiquity bring back to the broader enterprise of Jewish studies. Do scholars of Jewish antiquity care at all about what scholars of modernity are saying? These are difficult questions, but conceptual cross-fertilization will probably determine the long run of the field. Which brings me to Dreyfus's second observation. If the export of concepts back into the broader fields and importation from other fields is one measure of success, then Dreyfus also raises the important question of the concepts themselves. Concepts are not neutral, but as Dreyfus notes, following and drawing on David Engel, in important ways, concepts determine what we study and how we study it. They're first conceived in particular times and places, and then they migrate to other times and places to describe or depict what is frequently something very different, from monotheism to community to peoplehood. These concepts vary over time and space. Examples abound. Dreyfus invokes the concept of pogrom. For the obvious reasons, I'm going to talk about that for 1 second. The word itself comes from a specific time and place, Russia, and the violent targeting of Jewish civilians with exclusionary intent. But how would we know whether one has occurred? Is the pogrom planned or spontaneous or some weird admixture? Is it about neighbor-on-neighbor violence? Or is it about militias coming from outside of the community or the police attacking Jews? Or is it a bit of both? The stakes in these conceptual questions are high because they determine what we look for when we study it. Moreover, can we use the word pogrom, the concept of pogrom, to other times and places? In some ways, the question is moot. Not only Jews do this, regular people like my grandpa, but they've used the word pogrom for all kinds of events. But scholars do this as well. To take just two examples, Piet van der Horst's annotated version of Philo's description of the deadly riots in Alexandria in 38 CE, he calls it, in the subtitle, is the first pogrom. Robert Haverkamp, the eminent German scholar, uses the term to describe medieval violence and expulsions in the Holy Roman Empire in the 13th century. But were these pogroms, in the same sense of the word, as pogroms in Russia from the 1880s to the 1920s? Were they the same as 1941? What gets lost in having a concept that developed in a specific time and place migrate to others? Is it even scientifically sound? Or is it a form of kind of lazy malpractice that we all sort of engage in? I'm not sure. And in any case, the term has migrated well beyond the scholarly community and passed into ordinary language. And it's probably not worth having a fight about, though maybe we'll have a fight about it. But it is worth asking whether, if we can't agree on what something is, on whether something is a pogrom, will we have much chance of even explaining it if we don't know, if we can't even identify it? Now, I don't want to dwell on pogroms. The general point, and one that Dreyfus wisely reminds us, is how tricky it is to use concepts in Jewish studies, the study of a people who traverse huge expanses of time and space when formally identical and related concepts may have very different meanings. So who cares? Concepts, the reason we should care, I ask that in a kind of a rhetorical way. Concepts are the building blocks of comparison, and comparison is crucial whether we're comparing instances of anti-Jewish violence or different forms of Jewish communal life. Dreyfus invokes Hasidism across time and space. And comparing Jewish with analogous non-Jewish cases. And indeed, only by doing so will we make our own discipline legible and interesting to others. It's one of my main scholarly commitments. And to the extent that there's something new and something next in Jewish studies, such comparisons, as pathetic as it sounds, have to be part of it. But such a commitment has pitfalls, and in that one can easily engage in trivial comparisons or obfuscate what's important about each of the things being compared. But such pitfalls should not discourage us from importing and exporting concepts. They should simply make us more meticulous and imaginative scholars. Now, regarding concepts, there's a further issue that Javi Dreyfus touches on only briefly and indirectly, but it's worth highlighting. As scholars of Jewish studies, we frequently employ concepts and then try to illustrate them with empirical examples. This strikes me as a fundamental to any form of scholarship. But the concepts we deploy, take anti-Semitism as the most obvious case, are frequently thick and very well theorized. The theory and conceptual apparatus is sophisticated and nuanced and has been debated intensively. Scholars, for example, have devoted lots of time to explaining the difference between the Judeophobia in antiquity and racialized anti-Semitism of modernity. And this is good. The problem begins when we take these thick concepts and try to operationalize them or measure them with real-world examples. When we do that, we almost always deploy thin measurements of thick concepts. And there's always a slippage between concept and measurement. What we say we're going to do or describe, and what we actually do, what we actually engage in. An example, one obvious way of measuring anti-Semitism is violence. We know that there was anti-Semitism because anti-Jewish violence occurred. But how do we frequently account for this violence? Well, anti-Semitism. The circularity here is sort of obvious and slightly embarrassing, and there doesn't seem to be any easy way around it. To stay on anti-Semitism as a concept for one more second, we can try other ways of gauging antipathy towards Jews, and I've tried this. I've whacked my head against the wall trying to do this. But even these are not easy and often do little justice to the conceptual richness that we bring to our inquiries. Again, I don't think that there's any easy solution to this problem, except for being keenly aware of the trade-offs at work. Now, my final point. This third observation concerns Dreyfus's very cogent focus on sources and digitization. As she notes, archives have their own histories and biases, and the collections themselves frequently bias in the answers we provide and the questions we ask. Just because something or some factor is exceedingly well documented does not mean that it's descriptively accurate or even causally sound. One is reminded of the problem of the drunk looking for his keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is. The danger is we ignore potential explanations and important phenomenon just because the familiar sources point us elsewhere. Connected to this, however, is the proliferation of new sources and the possibility for digitization, and especially the compilation of large data sets, which I'm, of course, guilty of, which allow us to find previously unseen or hopefully underappreciated patterns. Of course, there's no substitute for actually knowing something about the cases that one's interested in. One can't simply be a good counter of stuff. Correlations, after all, may be spurious. But the big pitfall, as Dreyfus notes, is the social devaluation of expertise produced by the democratization of access to sources, something that has produced pernicious effects in politics and in science more generally. Just think about the damage done by amateur epidemiologists and conspiracy theorists who, quote, do their own research, right? Which is what QAnon tells people to do. In a field such as Jewish studies, where memory and history sit uneasily with each other, the threat to knowledge and expertise posed by disinformation, deep fakes, and bad actors in the new digital repositories may be the most difficult challenge we face in the years ahead. And it's not quite clear that we're up to it. And I commend Javi Dreyfus for putting this important point on the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kopstein. And our last respondent is Professor Jeffrey Weidlinger, who is Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Professor Weidlinger is an author of the forthcoming book In the Midst of Civilized Europe, The Pogroms of 1918-1921 and the Onset of the Holocaust, and the award-winning book In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small-Town Jewish Life in Soviet Ukraine. He is a chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish History, a member of Executive Committee of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and a member of Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And without further ado, Professor Weidlinger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for all of the remarks. It was really interesting to hear them. Javi's paper was fantastic, and the comments were also very thought-provoking. It's amazing how much one can say about what's new in Jewish studies. I think the only thing that would, the only question that would generate more discussion is what's wrong with Jewish studies. But I'm going to propose some things I think are right with Jewish studies, building off of Javi's really interesting points. So she raises 5 issues, and I'll kind of talk about each of them with a little bit of spin, giving my own version. So the first involves the relationship between Jewish studies, the study of Judaism, and other fields, this interdisciplinary nature of Jewish studies. And I'd state that, you know, from the outset, I think the way the field of Jewish studies evolved in the United States is as an interdisciplinary ethnic or area studies field. And I know this is a little bit different than the way it evolved in Europe and the way it evolved in Israel. There's certainly some continuities between Jewish studies as it evolved in the United States and the Wissenschaft movement of the 19th century, but I really don't think it's a direct line by any means. In the United States, Jewish studies emerged largely in consort with the identity politics that began in the 1960s and reached their apogee probably in the 1990s, although it continues to this day. But during this period, universities came to be seen as a place in the United States that young people develop their identities. And whether those are African American identities, Latinx identities, or Jewish identities. In the case of people of Jewish background, this development coincided with declining synagogue enrollment in the United States, meaning that for the Jewish students who in those days formed the majority of Jewish studies students, universities were in many ways replacing synagogues as the places in which Jews learned how to be Jews. That phenomena has changed a lot as Jewish studies programs and student bodies have become more diverse over time. And I think Jeff is certainly correct that Jewish studies is not just for Jews and is becoming less and less so, particularly with the development of Holocaust studies and other fields, and even biblical studies, and particularly graduate studies in Jewish studies are really attracting people from diverse backgrounds. And I would say that accommodating this diversity is both the biggest challenge that the field faces right now, as well as the biggest opportunity that the field has right now. And the ways that scholars are going to integrate the diversity of backgrounds of people who are entering the field, and diversity of backgrounds of people who are Jewish as well as who are non-Jewish, I think is going to be really interesting to see what happens. And we see it already in the 2 universities that I've been at, which are 2 of the largest Jewish studies programs in the United States, Indiana and Michigan. And both of them have had increasingly diverse student bodies and increasingly diverse faculty bodies. And I think that brings new perspectives to the field that in many ways makes the field of Jewish studies right now almost unrecognizable to those who were in it 20, 30 years ago. And I think some of you even commented on that in your remarks. Javi mentions also the relationship between Jewish studies and the studies of Judaism. And this, too, has been a complex relationship here in the United States. Originally, interestingly enough, many Jewish studies programs, when they were established, were placed within religious studies and departments of religious studies or divinity schools, indicating the ways in which the subject was addressed in those days. And even today, many programs are embedded within larger religious studies units. And this means that scholars of Jewish studies are often speaking to other scholars of comparative religions, rather than, say, of sociology. I think the field would have emerged very differently and would be different today if those Jewish studies programs had been placed in, say, anthropology departments. On the other hand, Jewish studies is also sometimes considered an area studies as opposed to an ethnic studies. And in those cases, a lot of Jewish studies programs in the United States are integrated or embedded within Middle East studies departments or Near East studies departments. And that also influences the way that Jewish studies is taught. It influences the type of research that Jewish studies scholars do, and it influences the way students see Jewish studies. So, for instance, at my university, in some ways, some of the older appointments are still in Middle East studies, meaning that our course on the Holocaust is taught under Middle East studies. And our course on American Judaism is taught, well, one of our courses on American Judaism is taught under Middle East studies. And that too influences who scholars are speaking to, what type of grants they're applying to, what type of funding they're getting. So these institutional placements influence not only the way the field is developed, but the way the field will develop in the future because of its placement. So I think we need to think about that in terms of what's going to be new in Jewish studies. Now, at the same time, there are a group of people right now who are thinking of moving away from interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity is now a little bit passé, and scholars are trying to recategorize Jewish studies as a methodology. These scholars are influenced by Joan Scott's famous 1986 article in the American Historical Review on gender as a useful category of analysis. And they're asking, can Jewish studies be a category of analysis? Is there a methodology, a way of critically approaching texts, for instance, that can be grafted from Jewish studies onto the other humanities? So instead of having the influence of Jewish studies just being that other disciplines, like, say, anthropology, study Jews, are there actual Jewish studies methods that can be employed by anthropology? And I think this is a really interesting question that we should think about in terms of the future. One can certainly argue that the type of critical analysis made famous by, say, the Frankfurt School or Jacques Derrida's deconstructionism or even Claude Lévi-Strauss's cultural relativism could be a basis on which to devise a Jewish studies methodology. It's interesting that all of these fields developed from people who were deeply embedded within traditional Jewish backgrounds. And yet those fields themselves now, the way they've developed, they're precisely the disciplines most likely to ignore Jews in their study. But is there something about the Jewish studies way of doing things? And in fact, I'd also argue that some of the concepts that are most commonly discussed in the humanities as a whole originated in Jewish studies. Things like the study of diasporas, the study of genocide, religious tolerance, ethnicity, migration, all owe much of their origins to Jewish studies. And if we look at the first people who were writing about migration, for instance, people like Joseph Schechtman, they're emerging out of the people who invented those fields, were very much emerging out of the field of Jewish studies. So although many people like to say, why hasn't Jewish studies contributed anything to the humanities as a whole? I think when you think about it, the study, again, trauma, migration, diaspora, ethnicity, I think we've contributed a lot to other disciplines. My colleague Deborah Dash Moore likes to say that Jews are good to think with. And I think she's absolutely right, that so many of the most critical questions in the humanities today have emerged out of the Jewish experience and out of ways that Jewish studies scholars have looked at those problems. Next, I'll talk a little bit about conceptualization, another issue that Happy brings up and that some of you responded to in your comments as well. And we can talk about the different ways that pogrom is understood, or the different ways that the term Holocaust is understood, I'd add. But I'll throw in another one, which is the different ways that the term Jew itself is understood. And in fact, I think this is also one of the major new directions in Jewish studies, is we need to better define who we're talking about when we're talking about Jews, and what sort of religious practices we're talking about when we talk about Judaism. What category even does the word Jew belong to? Does it define adherence to a religious practice? Can we ascertain who is a Jew through 23andMe or through DNA testing? Are Jews a sociological class in the way that Marx understood them? Are Jews a nation? Are they, if so, are they members? Are they able to be members of multiple nations? Who exactly is a Jew? And then in the question of individuals, how do we identify whether individuals are Jews as well, is a big question, particularly in the 20th century, where identity has become a choice that's much more malleable than it ever was before. The question becomes even more relevant. Should Jewish studies encompass, say, Soviet citizens with Jewish ethnic background who do not identify as Jews? Does it make a difference if those people, have their background through matrilineal or patrilineal lines? Does it make a difference if they've been discriminated against because of that background? How do we categorize who a Jew is? And again, in the 20th century, this has changed so much in Poland, in the former Soviet bloc, but in the United States as well. There's so many people, increasing numbers of people whose parents did not identify as Jews, but they are choosing to do so, and people whose parents did identify as Jews and they no longer are doing so. And to what extent those people are included and how we include them in our studies of Jewish studies. And this is all the more relevant for Jews of color, for Jews of African American heritage, for Jews of Asian heritage, or for that matter, for the large number of people in Africa, in the African continent, who identify as Jews, but have practices that many people in the field of Jewish studies would not recognize as Jewish, and backgrounds that people may not recognize as Jewish. So I think this is another major question, a major issue in the field of Jewish studies. I will say, at the University of Michigan, we recently did a big search on contemporary Jewish studies, and this emerged as the major issues, identifying who we're including in the ways that Jewishness is expanding, is becoming a very capacious term. I'll move on to archives for a little bit. And I would note that, interestingly, for many years, there were those who would argue that the only archive of Jewish studies was rabbinical texts. And I think there are probably some who would continue to make that argument today. If you're not studying rabbinical texts, they would argue, you're just not doing Jewish studies. I think most of us would reject that opinion, but it's still there. Today, I would note that a cult of the archive has emerged in the humanities as a whole. Derrida called it archive fever, which he reminded us that archiving is both a creative act and an act of preservation. We're preserving a past and we're creating a history. Post-colonial studies has picked up on that notion, trying to convince us to move away from imperial archives or state archives that tell only one side of the story, and to instead incorporate the stories of subalterns and those whose stories did not make it into the archive. As Javi points out, Ringelblum's efforts can be seen as a precursor to this. Just as Dubnov before him called upon the Jews of Russia to find and collect all the documents of Jewish history, and the Sammlers before Ringelblum set out to collect the ephemera and folklore of Eastern European Jews, or for that matter, Ansky and many others. And today, the work that Dovid Katz, that Valieri, that I have done in Eastern Europe also follows upon that, to interview people in Stetlach to try to collect oral histories and stories and linguistic patterns. And these maneuvers can be seen as early attempts to construct a post-colonial archive, an archive that tells history from the perspective of those whose stories and narrations didn't make it into the main archive. And it is indeed the challenge of future historians and scholars of all types to expand that archive, to find new materials and new ways of telling the story. And then digitization. As Javi points out, it's made it easier for scholars to access archives around the world, and in that sense has democratized history. And we think of it primarily in terms of providing researchers with ease of access to official archives. But at the same time, and this is where I think digitization really makes a difference, is it's allowed ordinary folks to create their own archives. And this is fascinating, the way ordinary people can just assemble documents telling their story and put it online for us to research, for researchers to look at. We see this on genealogical sites all the time. Jewish genealogical, whatever the website is, a huge collection of materials that ordinary people are putting their family heirlooms, their family pictures, family stories up online. At the same time, some museums and institutions are encouraging ordinary people to give collections and to put collections online, make them accessible to the general public. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's History Unfolded project is one example of this nature, in which people around the country were encouraged to go to their local libraries, look through newspapers or church newsletters to see how various aspects of the Holocaust were reported in those small towns. So you can see how in Des Moines, Iowa, a local church reported in their newsletter on what was on Kristallnacht, for instance. It's really important material. So I think that through this type of crowdsourcing, humanities scholarship was able to become a public project and is becoming a public project. And this is really the innovation of digitization and of archival. And this gets to Chavi's final point, is just as Dubnov, as the Zumlers, and as Ringelblum envisioned, we really are now at a point where we can have access to the ephemera, to the works of ordinary people, and we can study them, and ordinary people, however you want to define that, can contribute to us telling their story, and they can give information, they can put things online, and there's a dialogue going on. As public scholars, and I'd like to consider myself public scholar of the humanities, it's not only one way. Sometimes we think of public scholarship as people speaking to the public, but I think it's also very important that it's the public speaking to us, and that we should be influenced by what the public is saying. We should be listening to what they want to hear. Doesn't mean just regurgitating their stories, but it means bringing other voices into Jewish studies. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of that. And I think we're going to continue doing a pretty good job at that. Ringelblum hopefully would be proud of the direction that Jewish studies is going in today. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Weidinger. And now we have a lot of questions from the audience. I'm really sorry that we are having this conversation online and not at the museum, because it would look completely different. Now we can only see them, the questions on the chat, and the emotions on the public are getting higher and higher. So I would give Chavi Dreyfus about 10 minutes will be enough to give at least a short remark, because I want to give as much as time as possible to the public to answer the questions that appeared from the very beginning of our presentation. So Chavi, please.
Thank you, Michal. Actually, it is important because so many different threads are here, and many of the comments refer to some of my colleagues saying so. So I'll try to keep it short, and of course, I won't be able to refer to all the very different thoughts and aspects that arose by all four speakers. And I do thank you all for giving so much time to reading what I was thinking of and referring to it. So I'll just point out maybe a few thoughts or additional questions I was thinking of listening to you. So first of all, Monica, you raised so many important references, and one of the things that I myself is very much troubled is on the one hand, there are so many connections between the Polish academia and the Israeli academia, but at the bottom line, when many times we read research, as you said, those are two parallel lines. And things that are very well researched in Israel are under research in Poland and vice versa. And here I think the theme of languages that you mentioned, and in some way Valerie referred to as well, is not only the linguistic languages of Polish, Hebrew, German, Yiddish, but also the languages of the different perspectives. And we hear people from anthropology and literature and political science and everything. And each one of those different language at least forced me to think of those thematical things in a different way. And really one of the problems that we have referring to the digital world, as you said, is that we think that things are very, very accessible now, but so many documents are still buried in archives. And I'm always telling my students that the most important book that you will read will not be the one that I am referring you to, but the one that you will bump in the shelf, or the one that is in the next corridor in the library. So I guess that, and listening to you, I was thinking that one of our challenges, hopefully getting out of this Zoom world, is to go back to those archives and go back to those libraries and go back to those personal meetings and not staying in the Zoom, because so much more will be learned from there. And I was thinking of those aspects listening to Valerie as well, because I was thinking, actually listening to you of Olga Goldberg's works and other anthropologists, and I was trying to ask myself not what is being what one can find in different collections, but what is really overlooked by all of us. And sometimes it's an easy thing, because historians look at one thing and then you go to anthropologists and they see other sources. But in some cases, we all overlook important information, which could be artifacts, which could be space, could be time, and could be other things. And one of the challenges, another challenges I think we all face, is really understanding where those lacunas are. Because we can name here visual documentation that, for example, in Holocaust studies, the recent book of Wendy Lauer, the important project of Tal Brutman and his friends, and other referring to visual documentation, archaeological work done in Sobibor and other things. But those are the easy lacunas, I think. I'm asking myself, what don't we see at all? And what don't we collect at all? Even today, when we are creating new archives and new collections and new wonderful database. And I would also want to refer shortly to some terms of conceptualization, because I'll start with actually the last thing that was said by Jeffrey. I was listening to you when you asked, what does it really mean, the concept of Jew? And I was thinking, maybe the next step is, what does it mean, the concept of Jewish? When does something become Jewish? Is it because it's somebody from a Jewish origin, or is an act could be considered Jewish? This is, of course, very much connected to what Israel Bartal has just asked. When is something become Jewish? I will give just one example. There is this resistance group in Algeria during the Second World War, which was composed mainly of Jews and headed by Georges Albuquerque, who was Jewish by his origin. But whenever it was referred to his resistant work as something Jewish, he was very much offended, because he was a communist. And he didn't see any of his act as something Jewish. So one of the main questions you already mentioned, Jeffrey, is what is Jew, but what is Jewish and what makes something Jewish or non-Jewish? And this, of course, can be elaborated to many different aspects. And the last thing I want to refer to, because I really want to leave time to my colleagues in this seat as well, is really, I'm sorry, some of the things that Jeff Kopstein said, which I'm not sure we will agree on. Of course, first of all, is the question of pogroms. Now, you are an expert, and of course, there are other experts here that dealt with pogrom, but I will say that part of defining a specific event as a pogrom is to stress the victimhood of the people who were assaulted. For example, this is why those riots of Jaffa in 1921 were referred as riots or events, and not pogrom, because here in Israel, those new Jews are not as powerless as they were in the diaspora. So referring to something as a pogrom has some other aspects which we should take into account referring to that. And something that I'm afraid we might disagree is this connection that you made between anti-Semitism and violence. Now, at least in the Holocaust studies, I think that one of the important things we see lately is that there could be many different reasons for the violence against Jews. Sometimes the reason or the motivation was really anti-Semitism, whatever you defined it as Nazi anti-Semitism or traditional anti-Semitism, and there is a great variety here. But sometimes the reason for this violence could be envy of before the war, could be terror, could be just, wanting to get the money of those Jews or anything else. So, and I think that here we should make the differentiation of motivation, which are much more complicated when we go into it. But if I would have had to take one thing of all the different of all my colleagues and those different aspects that was just arose, I would take the word that you, Jeffrey, just said, referring to dialogue, because actually being an academic, on the one hand, it's a very lonely experience because we work with the books and with the documents, and we write first of all to ourselves. But actually, what crystallizes our work is really the dialogue, which many times, unfortunately, I feel is a very limited dialogue, because we talk mainly with our friends and people that not only we agree on, but we have the same aspect or same thematic topics. And one of the things that might be the most challenging is really trying to understand our notion with people from different times, people dealing with different times, different aspects, and mainly people who don't agree with us. And I think that at least in this seat we had so many contradicting point of view, which at least for me rose some interesting thoughts. So I'll stop here and leave the floor to others and questions, and maybe we can continue on later.
Yes, thank you. We have, I think there is a coffee room that we can continue the discussion after we end the panel. I strongly encourage those whose questions won't be asked here, because we have a limited time, as you know. The first question was from Artur Markowski, who asks about the separatism of Jewish studies. He asked directly to Javi, but I think it's a broader question to all of you. It is very clear, he says that it's very clear in the studies of the history of the violence that Jewish historiography and non-Jewish historiography ignore each other. And I think this is the case not only in the history of violence, some of you already pointed that issue. So I wonder, what is your answer? And Artur Markowski also wonders how we can change this ignoring process.
Well, as you said, this is a question we all refer to. I will say that it's very obvious for us as scholars of Jewish studies, what in any way we define it, that we cannot deal with the Jewish issues without the wider context. And one problem is that sometimes those wider contexts are being dealt without referring to the Jewish aspect in it. So this separation is something that is maybe natural, but it has its prices in our research, and I think in wider circles as well. And the problem is that many times for us to be involved in those discussions, which are so far away from our specific topics, is more problematic than being in our natural environment. But this is something that we should force ourselves. And actually, this kind of conference that really puts so many people, okay, we all deal with different way with Jewish studies in Poland, but still this is opening, I think, for this kind of problem, which definitely exists in Jewish studies and not only here.
Maybe if I can offer a response as well. I think actually what's interesting about Artur's question is that it's, he says, with the exception of the Holocaust. And I think that's a big exception. The study of the Holocaust has influenced the study of ethnic conflict in so many important ways, where my colleagues who are doing work on ethnic conflict anywhere around the world are intimately familiar with Holocaust scholarship, because the methodologies that have been developed in that field have been transplanted to those fields as well. And I think one reason they may be ignoring other types of anti-Jewish violence is because historians of Jewish studies have ignored other types of violence until recently. There's been a lot of work in the last 10 years or so on pogroms, and even before that, some work on medieval anti-Jewish violence. But for the most part, Jewish studies as well has concentrated so overwhelmingly on the Holocaust that we've ignored other types. And then just one way in which what we've done on violence has influenced other fields is the use of the word pogrom. That, as Jeff points out, pogrom is used commonly to refer to riots in Gujarat or riots in wherever in Latin America, and that in and of itself is indicative of the influence that Jewish studies and the Jewish experience has had on the way that we look at violence in other fields.
I'll just say that some Holocaust researchers say and criticize that even in Holocaust studies, we don't refer enough to those ethnical tensions and other things. And you can see, for example, Omer Bartov last work and others as well, trying to stress the wider picture, referring to those ethnic differences as well during the Second World War and their impact on Holocaust studies.
Anyone else wants to refer to this? If not, then I have another general question. Okay, so another question is from Natalia Alexion, who asks also, have you got also other panelists to comment on the turns they consider productive for the field of Jewish studies? Maybe starting from somebody else than Javi this time. Okay, maybe Professor Adamczyk-Gadłowska.
Yeah, I could say that in literary studies, for example, there have been a number of turns. For example, studies on Polish Jewish literature that were initiated in the actually late 80s by Eugenia Prokopianiec, by Władysław Panas, and then continued. Now in Yiddish studies, within Yiddish studies, for example, there is this turn to from the classics to popular literature. For example, there are a number of young researchers dealing with Schund, which the popular literature, which is originally it's a contemptuous term, Schund, some kind of trash, bad literature, but actually it has this rich potential. So there are a number of these kind of new fields that are being entered. So I consider, from my point of view, I consider them quite interesting. Obviously, this kind of here, I found it very interesting what Jeffrey said about how different, and what actually Barbara Kirschenblatt wrote here in her question, how different the origin of this revival of Polish Jewish studies in Poland is, let's say, from the situation in America, that, lots of these scholars in Poland are not Jewish. They are, and their interest in Jewish studies actually was stimulated by the absence, by neglect. Well, we all know this. So this is something completely different than what Jeffrey said about this development in the US. But of course, we could continue. So just a few comments.
Anyone else? Maybe Jeffrey Kopstein? I thought that you wanted to.
Yeah, okay. Since Monica brought up Barbara's question, and I'll tie it back in. This issue of the integration into the disciplines, I agree with Jeff that in history, it's probably more true that the concepts of the Holocaust have been incorporated into the study of other places in the world. But what's absolutely remarkable, my own discipline, political science, which, it's huge in the United States. Every year, there's a meeting with 10,000 political scientists in 3 hotels. It's gigantic. And what's even more remarkable about it is there's never been an ethnic census done in political science. But I'd say, just walking around looking at the last names of people, about 20% of those political scientists are Jewish. You'd think there would have been some interest in Jewish studies from within political science, but there wasn't. And the reason there wasn't is because, here I hypothesize, they were running away from it. They were running away from it because they thought this was not an important, it was a parochial set of questions. If you want to be central to your discipline, you work on big questions like democracy and dictatorship and revolution. You don't work on this kind of tiny little marginal group. In the first 20 years of my career, I studied Eastern Europe and communism and the collapse of communism and democracy afterwards. And then I made this jump into Jewish studies. And uniformly, my colleagues said, this is Meshugana. This is crazy. Why are you doing this? You're self-sabotaging your own career by jumping into this. And my response was always, and Jeff, I really appreciate him bringing this up. Well, my response was always, look, if Latinos can study Latinos in the United States, Latino politics, and if African Americans can study Black politics, and if women can study women in politics, why can't some portion of Jews study Jews in politics? It seems to be, and so in many ways, and that was a good argument, in many ways, the ethnic studies revolution in the United States made kosher, if you will, the study of Jews within the social sciences. So it's really only over the last 10 or 15 years, it's a relatively new thing. In political science and sociology, especially, but I think even anthropology, it's a relatively new thing where you have large numbers of people doing this. And that answers Barbara's question about the kind of marginalization. I'll leave aside her question of comparison. That's another good one if we reach that far.
Some interest, maybe? Thinking about turns in Jewish studies, and then we go to Javi and then the next questions. You are muted, Professor Dimshitz.
Thank you. Maybe I'll give some comment a little bit later when we'll go to the question of Professor Barbara Kirschenblatt.
Okay, of course. Javi, can you answer?
Yes, first of all, to Natalia's question, I must admit I'm not a great fond of the terms that you refer to, and this is, of course, not a surprise to anybody who knows my research. And the linguistic, cultural, and spatial turn has their importance and has their impact. But as somebody who is basing his research mainly on the archival document, I'm one of those old-fashioned historians. I feel that many times those became some kind of a specific topic that is now very much researched, but its impact on Holocaust studies and other is much more narrow than it seems. So it's, in my point of view, it's just another important tool which should the researcher use, just as they use other tools which are important. But I want to refer to another thing that I was thinking of listening to the last comments, and that is how different the Israeli development, Israel scholarship development in many aspects is from what happened in Poland and in the United States. Because on the one hand, one could find many references of political science scholars to the Holocaust. Shlomo Avineri and Shlomo Aronson, for example, who dealt with those topics for years, as well as in other spheres. I think that it will be very hard to find any specific scholarly aspect which didn't have any connection to the Holocaust in general. But one of the problems that we are facing today in Israel, and this was one of the results of a committee of the Israeli Academy of Science, is that in the last few years and maybe decades or 2 decades, there was a great decrease in Holocaust studies in Israel. And this is something that has its impact on different topics that are being researched today. So I just thought that this should be mentioned as well, because Holocaust studies are not so vivid as they were in the past in Israel. And this is another problem.
Thank you very much. The next question was asked directly to Professor Dimshitz. It was asked by Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimbert. She asked about the relationship between Jewish studies as area studies and the disciplines, because she writes that I have the impression that our fields, the social science, are marginal to Jewish studies, and Jews as a subject of studies is marginal to disciplines, especially to the social sciences. What do you think, and what can be done about it? And she asked, later, yesterday, Sally Berkowitz said that the Rothschild Foundation wanted to encourage and support research on contemporary Jewish life, but they did not get many applications. I think that she said that none applications on any good ones, and those they were got out yet were not very good. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you. First of all, thank Professor Kirshenblatt Gimblett for the great question, and more or less it is the same question as was asked by Artur Markovsky. The rhetoric is a little bit different, but the meaning the same. The name of our conference is What's New, What's Next? What about next? I'll try to say, but what about new? Nothing new. The gap between Jewish studies and other areas of humanities is the trauma from the very beginning. Yes, the starting impulse of the Wissenschaftsjudentums in the days of, I don't know, Leopold Zunz was Zunz tried to show to his colleagues in other fields of humanities the Jewish culture, Jewish literature in post-biblical times is also something interesting, something rich, something important to the world culture. Yes, so it is the trauma of our field of work from the very beginning till now. Yes, what can be done? I have two answers. Answer number one is that in the field of Jewish studies, in the very concrete things, are a lot of methods and concrete facts and ideas which are absolutely useful for the different humanities, and we are speaking not only about the analogies or some methodological principles, but about the very concrete things. We have no time for the concrete samples, but believe me, that's true, and I'll try to discuss many concrete things with my colleagues from absolutely different fields. For example, just now, I'm being in dialogue with a specialist in the field of Russian Orthodox icons, medieval icons. And they realized that some very important things on the icons are quite ununderstandable, quite unclear without the concrete knowledge in the field of Jewish studies. Another answer, you see, it's quite concrete thing. Another answer is another hope we can find in the thesis from Professor Weidlinger. He mentioned that the starting point for the Jewish studies in American universities was that universities became the place where Jewish Americans received, constructed their identity. Yes, but we have different types of identity. Except national identity or religious identity, there is something which we may call the local identity or area identity. And as we know that there are not dozens but thousands places in the Eastern and Central Europe which were the flourishing centers of a Jewish life before the war, and now we have no Jewish population at all, but people realized that the Jewish past, Jewish monuments, Jewish memory, Jewish folklore is the very important part of their local identity, and we can see how important it became, and more important for the local communities, local authorities, volunteers, and so on and so on and so on. This is our hope. Meanwhile, speaking about the parallels between Jewish and non-Jewish problems, it's also not a unique thing. Absolutely not a unique thing. You know that after the Second World War, Eastern Prussia became part of Soviet Union, and now it is part of the Russian Republic, Russian Federation. Yes. In 1946, German population was expelled from Prussia, and all population, now it's Kaliningradskaya Oblast, yes, Kaliningrad region of Russian Federation, was people came from different parts of Russia. They were settled, they were invited, they were immigrants, they were forced to settle there, they were invited to settle, anyway, from different places. Believe me that now in constructing of local identity, local, if you want, mythology, the German past, medieval German past of 19th century became the most important thing for the people who are living now in Kaliningrad, yes? And they believe that it's not a Kaliningrad, it is some imagined Königsberg, imagined, of course, there is no Königsberg at all. So we can see the same things. It's normal. It's something which is in the nature of human beings, in the nature of the people. And I believe that if we are speaking about the identity, as Jewish identity is a resource for the Jewish studies, I don't know, in the United States, local identity, area identity is the resource for the Jewish studies in Europe. People realized, not all of them, of course, not everywhere, but people realized that the Jewish culture, Jewish literature, in a broad context, is an important part of the European culture, Polish culture, Ukrainian culture, and so on and so on and so on. That's it. This is my hope.
Thank you very much. We have little time left. I think the next. I'm sorry. I hope that Barbara will forgive me for not asking her question, because it would be the second question from her and asking a question from Professor Poloński, which could be a positive or a bad end to our conversation, because he asked Valery Dymschys, but I think this is a problem that we all face and we all have to deal with. That is the problem created in humanities by the rise of the populism. How are we to rise above the divisions which Professor Dymschys so eloquently highlighted, and that you all nearly all mentioned in your speeches? So starting from Javi, and then we can go as we had our responses.
Well, I think the question is better than any answer I would raise, and some of the answer was already given by Professor Dymschys. But I would say that open-minded and continue asking those questions in larger context than just a narrow one is part of it. I would also want just very, very shortly to refer to another question that I see that was raised by Dariusz, if there's a new interest in other fields, and I will say that I want to refer to it just because a friend just told me, a friend that doesn't deal with Poland and Eastern European studies, he said, well, what was once so interested in Eastern European studies is now what is happening in the research of Jewish communities in the Arab world. And I'm not sure that I agree with him, but I think that this is also part of the thing that we're facing now.
Well, actually, I ended my response with the statement that we should kind of rise above this. Regimes, fortunately, political configurations are not constant, and we can even take advantage of them as kind of, stimulating in a sense, like to work against some kind of pressures. And, for me, since I've been observing the development of Jewish studies, let's say, from the late 70s. So when I see how much was done, and those divisions, those barriers that were even here broken by Anthony Polonsky and Pauline and the circle of scholars, like this, even this kind of symbolic border between Jan Błoński's article and after Błoński, before Błoński and post Błoński. So basically to go in these directions and continue cooperation, and not to let, there might be tensions, for example, between Poland and Israel, different groups, but we have to create, I think, a community of scholars. But I agree with Javi, what Javi mentioned, that the problem is that we often are within our circle. So we basically communicate mainly with the people who think similarly. On the other hand, sometimes it's very difficult to, let's say, have a panel discussions, including people who have a completely different agenda. So let's do what we can. What else can I say?
We are nearly out of time. Let's have a few words from Professor Dymschitz, maybe.
About populism.
Yes. But just a few words.
Just a few words. Thank you. It's a big core question. I have no good answer. You know the idea that satire is a medicine for the healthy. And what about humanities, magazines, conferences, research work as a medicine against different strange popular ideas, superstition, and so on? I'm not sure that it is a good medicine. But what can we do? First of all, I agree with Professor Adamczyk Garbowska that landscape is in each concrete moment quite pessimistic. But when we look on it in the historical perspective, compare, for example, what we have today with the 80s, yes, we have some reasons to be optimistic, yes. The trend, the evolution is very, very optimistic. Who knows what will be later? I hope everything will be good.
Professor Kopstein, maybe?
Well, populism, don't do it. that would be my first reaction. But honestly, everything that's been said, that there's a kind of to resist the politicization of science, and it's easy to say, and it's always been in my career easy to do. But that's because until recently, I lived in a country where things weren't so politicized. But I see now, even the way for me when I'm working on something like the Holocaust or Jewish studies, it's easier for me not to get drawn in to politics. But when I see my colleagues who work on American politics, if they find things and I can think 2-3 steps ahead to see, could this possibly be in support of somebody who I think is terrible? Then it's hard for me to resist that, I have to admit. And so that's really when we say resist the politicization of science, you have to say resist the politicization of science, even when it touches on your most valued forms of inquiry. And that's hard to do. That's it's easier said than done. So while I agree with the prescription, I think the medicine, the pill, can be a very bitter one sometimes.
Professor Weidinger, maybe a last word, because we are out of time. I'm sorry.
So I know we're over time, so I'll just say that I think Jewish studies offers a lot of responses to populism, and the Jewish experience also offers a lot of responses to populism. So my comment would simply be to quote Talmud, to say, go and learn, and learning leads to action. And hopefully that's the best response that we can give. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your wonderful talks and your wonderful responses. I'm really sorry that we were not able to ask all the questions that were there visible for you in the chat. So I hope that you will be able to continue the discussion. Normally we would go to a lobby for a coffee or tea and cakes, but right now you can go to the coffee room here at the platform of the conference, and I strongly encourage you all who are listening to us and all of the speakers today, distinguished speakers today, to join us in the fourth day of our conference tomorrow, and to join us in today's lectures that are upcoming in the parallel sessions. So thank you once again, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.